Hello, how are you? I hope you're having a good day. We are continuing our Zettelkasten 101 series today, and let's talk about the backbone of a Zettelkasten system, address and index. Address is the unique identifier you assign to each of your nodes, and it also provides a framework for organization. Your address will follow a naming convention that could be a combination of components, such as timestamps, numeric, alphanumeric, or semantic. Each component has its strengths and limitations. For instance, alphanumeric has the most flexibility in establishing hierarchy, but timestamps and semantic components provide context. You can mix and match the components to design a format that makes the most sense for the purpose you want your Zettelkasten to serve. For example, if you are keeping a collection of reflection entries or an ongoing research, then timestamps may be more meaningful to your system to provide chronological organization. If your Zettelkasten is for project management or professional documentation, then semantic labels could provide more obvious context when you're browsing. You can also include separators such as period, hyphen, underscore, or even letter case to differentiate between components and to introduce hierarchy. I've seen a lot of people stressing over the right address format, but the truth is, address is probably not as important as you think. If we go back to the purpose of address, it's simply to provide a unique identifier for each of your nodes so that you can differentiate them from one another. As for the organization framework, as long as it works broadly, it will likely be sufficient enough because for most use cases, you'll mostly be relying on your index for retrieval. So whatever identifier your node has or where it sits doesn't really matter as long as it is unique and you know exactly where to find it. An index is even simpler than address. Label 26 cards with each letter of the alphabet, then append keywords as and when they pop up when you file your notes. The important thing while you're indexing is to remember that this is for retrieval, which means that the keywords that you choose are the potential search terms that you will use when you want to find these nodes again. Let's do a walkthrough so that it's easier to visualize. Let's go back to the example that we used for our previous video. We have created our first node, humans' desire for eternal life brings about an abuse of power and acts of cruelty. Let's give this an address. We'll be using alphanumeric as an example for this walkthrough. So for this, let's call this 1. We also made a note about impermanence the last time, so let's expand on that with a new note. This note is a continuation from our first note. Let's call it 1A. Let's say we have another thought about technology and medicine. We have our first note, our parent note, which talks about immortality and how it can potentially bring about an abuse of power or acts of cruelty. We have followed it up with a note on philosophical traditions, for example, Buddhism, that teach us about accepting impermanence. And now we have another note that talks about modern advancements in medicine that often privilege the wealthy. There's a choice here. I can append this to the Buddhism node to continue developing this thread, or I can park it directly under the parent node to create a separate thread for potential expansions in the future. And I think that's what I will do here. So let's call this 1B. And let's make another node. If we were to look back at our existing nodes, this new note on how instead of chasing eternal life, we should focus on improving the quality of finite lives feels more closely related to the thread on impermanence than the one on wealthy privilege. So I will be parking it under here, which means that the address will be 1A1 as a continuation. Everything looks good and organized until we have an awkward node. You know, the kind of node that doesn't quite fit anywhere, and let's say for some strange reason, I really want it between 1A and 1A1. So how can we do that? One of the ways that we can do this is to use separators. I can call this 1A point A. I can also call this 1A.1. I can also use letter case 1A capital letter A. So what the separators do is to help me establish a hierarchy between the address. Because of this period, I can tell that this is the parent and this is the child. So when referencing, I can tell that this awkward note belongs to the 1A level than the 1A1 level. But in my experience, a lot of times when it comes to situations like this, we are likely overthinking this entire thing. It really wouldn't make a big difference whether this awkward note sits immediately behind 1A, behind 1A1, or even as an adjacent note. A lot of times, as long as this is nested under the correct parent category, you can easily retrieve this. And besides, that's what we have the index for. Remember earlier in the video, we talked about how when you index, you should index the search terms that you actually use. Here is an example of it. Even though this note says humans' desire for eternal life brings about an abuse of power and acts of cruelty, when I am going to look for this note, I wouldn't be looking for the term eternal life. I'll be more likely to look for the term immortality. And that's what we are going to index for this card. We'll take a card, label it I, and let's write down our keyword. And we'll also note down the address associated with this. Now, as we move on to the second card, it is also talking about immortality. There is an option here for you to continue adding on to the index, which is to include the next related note whenever there are more than one card under a particular keyword. I take it as a sign that an emergent topic might be developing. So what I like to do is to pull this into a sub-index on its own. At the sub-index level, I like to give a little bit more context. And on the main index, I will make a note to show that this has been migrated into a sub-index. Usually I do this with an arrow. So the next time I'm browsing through my index and I want cards related to immortality, I know that there is a sub-index card that carries more details about all the notes related to this topic. And before we go, I have 3 learnings that I would like to share from my own experience. The first one is to not be greedy. It is very tempting to try to over-index every single search term and keyword that you can think of because we are scared that we might never find this card again. But I will say, have faith in yourself. Make sure that you don't cross a point where your system grows to be overly high maintenance and that it is not causing too much friction in the process. So there was this point where I was definitely over-indexing, and whenever it comes to processing my notes, it was a chore. And I actually dropped off my Zettelkasten for a bit because I just couldn't deal with it. The second learning is to not be overzealous. There are a lot of templates and styles around, and the important thing to remember that whatever you choose to adopt has to make sense for your Zettelkasten. Because everybody's Zettelkasten is set up for a different purpose and everybody has their own way of thinking. Some of them may look very appealing to you, but ultimately it comes down to whether it fits. It is also very tedious to change the setup, especially once you have amassed a certain volume of notes. So I'll recommend to invest some time to think about the purpose you want your Zettelkasten to serve and also to visualize the workflow before implementing any new components. When I was first starting out, I had this grand idea of, on top of index, I'm also going to color code it so that I can have a 2-axis reference system, and no, it didn't work out. Simplicity is really the key to a sustainable and enjoyable system. And the last learning I have for you is to not be stubborn. Because with all this being said, if something really doesn't work, change it. This is a personal system and we need to love it in order for us to use it. If something is constantly bugging you, just cut your losses. Even if it meant relabeling all your cards, I will say do it if it means that you are going to use it more. Okay, that's all I have for you guys today. I hope you enjoyed the video and see you in the next one. Bye!